The caravan stirs at dawn, a slow resurrection beneath a sky still clinging to the last indigo remnants of night. The crackle of newly fed fires licks the chill from the air, their smoke mingling with the drowsy scent of sandalwood and the sharp musk of horses. Each breath carries the mingled memories of last night's incense-heavy bargaining tents and the lingering sweat of travel. Around me, blurred figures shake off sleep, their movements deliberate, whispered like the prayers drifting from Mongol lips toward the rising sun, and the murmured Chinese verses spoken over steaming bowls of rice porridge. My fingers tighten around my ledger, the worn parchment edges smooth against my palm, each entry proof of a bargain struck, of goods weighed and reckoned between cultures still uneasy in their shared footsteps. Hooves clatter against the courtyard's weathered cobblestones, sharp as a scribe's brush strokes, loading beasts groaning under bales of silk wrapped in felt, delicate Jiangnan porcelain lashed with sturdy Mongol rope. Nearby, a young Mongol merchant pauses in cinching his saddle, his hands resting on the leather as he watches a Chinese trader adjust the straps, both hesitant, both uncertain of the other's way, until a shared glance binds them in silent acknowledgement of the long road ahead. The rising sun spills molten gold over the tiled rooftops of Dadu's western quarter, igniting the gilded eaves of temples where Mongol and Han gods sit uneasily beside one another, their incense ash mingling in the morning breeze. A sting of tea on my tongue, bitter yet fragrant, the taste of home for one man, horse milk and salt for another. The city exhales around us, a tide of noise swelling beyond the courtyard walls. The rhythmic calls of porters shifting loads, the distant chime of temple bells, the chant of sailors down at the docks weaving Persian and Uyghur into the music of commerce. My thumb brushes the ledger's most recent entry, a debt owed in silver, half Mongol, half Chinese script, and for an instant, I imagine the ink bleeding into a seamless whole. Beneath my feet, the earth thrums with the weight of 100 footfalls, the promise of a road that stitches not lands alone, but lives. A child laughs unseen, sharp and bright as a sparrow's song, and in its echo, I catch the shape of a dream that one day our disputes might boil down to nothing more than whose turn it is to stir the pot. The caravan master calls out, his voice a rough bridge between two tongues, and we move as one creature now, dust rising in our wake like incense smoke, carrying the scent of camphor, sweat, and something softer beneath green shoots pushing through cracked earth. The city stirs before dawn, its breath still heavy with the clinging musk of sandalwood, and the faint, sweet tendrils of night-burned incense, remnants of evening prayers and secret negotiations drifting through carved wooden shutters. My fingers flex against the ledger's worn cover, stiff from the lingering chill of the gobi's exhale, though the first blush of sunrise has already begun to soften the edges of the world. Beneath me, the uneven cobblestones tremble with the distant clatter of hooves, a rhythmic percussion of Mongol ponies and sturdy Chinese drafts, each step a divided echo of conquest and commerce. Voices rise and fall in the market square ahead, Uyghur traders chanting prices in rolling Turkic vowels, Persian silk sellers bargaining in honeyed Persian, Han merchants responding in crisp Mandarin, all punctuated by the guttural bursts of Mongol guards laughing over shared roasted lamb skewers, their breath steaming in the dawn air. The scent of charred meat and cumin tangles with the earthy bitterness of freshly ground tea leaves, the teas themselves laid out in meticulous rows. Delicate silver needles from Fujian beside the fermented brick-dark pu'er favored by the steppe riders, who cradle their bowls like sacred offerings. My hand hovers over the page, inkbrush trembling not from cold but from the weight of capture. How to record such a morning? The hand salt merchant to my left bows low to the rising sun, palms pressed together in quiet homage, while the Mongol fur trader beside him splashes his face with handfuls of icy water from a brass basin, scattering droplets like scattered pearls, his laughter sharp as a wolf's bark. A Uyghur spice seller unfurls his prayer rug toward Mecca, the embroidered silk whispering against stone, his murmured Arabic a counterpoint to the clinking beads of a Buddhist monk's rosary nearby. Each gesture a language, each ritual a dialect of devotion. I inhale deeply, the air thick with contradictions, oxhide glue simmering in a craftsman's pot, the prickly scent of drying peppers, the faint metallic tang of ink as I press brush to paper. The ledger demands neutrality, but my own breath hitches at the memory of my father's voice, harsh as wind through the great wall's gaps. They will never bend to us, nor we to them. Yet here, in this cramped alley between worlds, a Tibetan trader shares a pinch of salt with a Hui moneylender, their fingers brushing an act so small, so unremarkable, it aches with possibility. My brush moves at last, tracing characters with deliberate slowness, each stroke a bridge, each line a testament. The sun climbs higher, gilding the roof lines of mosques and pagodas alike, and for a heartbeat, the dust motes dancing in its light seem to pause, suspended between earth and heaven, as if the city itself holds its breath waiting, hoping, for the shape of what we might become. The caravan stirs to life before dawn, the last embers of the cook fires coughing up thin threads of smoke that twine with the heavy perfume of sandalwood, and myrrh offerings left beneath the market's gilded Buddha statues overnight. My worn ledger presses firm against my ribs as I adjust my sash, and already the pages hum with an ache for ink. The stone streets click and clatter under the impatient hooves of Mongol ponies, their coats glazed with sweat despite the morning's chill, while the ox-drawn carts of Chinese merchants creak forward, their stacked porcelain whispering like wind chimes. A salt-edged breeze lifts the flap of a yurt where a wrestling match had flared hours before both combatants nursing blackened eyes now, their muttered curses in two tongues prickling the air between them. Behind me, the haggling begins anew. A Mongol trader spits at the scales held by a silk-robed merchant from the south, his fingers stiff as he flips a silver ingot, testing its weight against the promise of jade pendants carved with peonies. The ledger trembles in my grip. Yesterday, this parting of hands would be sealed with laughter and shared kumis. Today, suspicion knots every syllable. I watch a Chinese apprentice flinch when a Mongol's dagger its hilt wrapped in wolf fur clatters onto the bargaining table, though the gesture had only been to slice a pomegranate. The fruit bleeds onto the wood, its seeds like scattered rubies. This brittle dance was born miles back, in the way Mongol riders chuckled at the incense burners lashed to southern wagons, or how the silk traders trailed their fingers over horsehair lassos with feigned disinterest. Even the roadside shrines bear fractures, now crushed lotus petals trampled beneath felt boots, a crumpled prayer strip snagged on a saddle horn. My stylus hesitates over the page. To record this divergence feels like splitting skin. Yet in the shifting light, I catch flickers of defiance. A young Mongol rider passing a skin of arag to his hand counterpart, both their palms dusted with the same ochre clay from loading crates. An elderly Chinese grandmother tucking a steamed bun into the sleeve of a grumbling camel driver. Their quiet rebellions linger like the scent of pine after rain. If I press my ear flush to the ledger's spine, I swear I can hear the faint strum of a pipa from some distant courtyard, its melody threading through the dissonance, not erasing it, but weaving something wholly new. The first drop of ink bleeds into parchment. I exhale and write. The midday sun burns like molten bronze overhead, its light merciless and unobstructed, turning the dust-choked air of the outpost into a shimmering mirage. My fingers twitch reflexively against the reins as our caravan rolls forward, the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves on the rough-hewn stone streets reverberating through my bones, synchronizing with the frantic pulse of the trading post around us. The scent of sandalwood clings to my robes smuggled from the far south mingling, with the sharper tang of incense drifting from portable altars set up along the roadside, where merchants whisper prayers before bargaining. Laughter and bartering voices swirl together, some in the guttural tones of Mongols, others in the rounded syllables of Chinese, punctuated by the occasional clink of coin or the rustle of silk being unfurled for inspection. My own breath catches as I survey the sprawling bazaar half-tented, half-permanent, a patchwork of Mongol felt and Chinese wooden stalls where Persian glass glints beside celadon bowls, and Turkic silver collars hang beside lacquered tea caddies. A deep ache tightens my chest, something beyond the weariness of travel, as I catch a Mongol trader tearing a strip of Chinese brocade between his calloused fingers, testing its strength, while the hand merchant flinches at the rough treatment. My hands tighten on the reins. Will we ever speak the same language? I think, the question gnawing beneath my ribs like hunger. Nearby, a tea seller ladles steaming liquid into clay cups for a group of northern horsemen, their fur-lined coats at odds with the southern porcelain they hold so carefully, their laughter laced with uneasy deference. The smell of roasted lamb drifts from a nearby spit, rich and fatty, blending with the nutty aroma of millet cakes familiar. Comforting, yet the way a Uyghur spice merchant inhales sharply at the scent makes my pulse quicken. Recalling last week's argument in Kashgar when a Mongol officer dismissed Sichuan peppercorns as fire that weakens the gut. I exhale, unclenching my jaw and dismount, my boots sinking slightly into the dust before finding purchase on the worn cobbles. Nearby, a child half-Mongol, half-Han by the look of her round cheeks and narrow eyes darts between stalls, clutching a handful of raisins, her bare feet sure and quick. Something in me eases for a fleeting moment before I notice the sidelong glances she draws from both sides. My fingers brush the ledger at my belt, its pages heavy with tallies and debts, silk and jade, but none of them list the cost of suspicion. A gust of wind tugs at my sleeves, carrying the scent of camels and damp earth, and for a heartbeat, I imagine the steppes and the rice fields breathing in unison. A Chinese merchant in indigo robes bargains loudly with a Tibetan trader over a bolt of Central Asian dye, their hands dancing above the fabric, one grasping, the other flicking away in refusal, but then, unexpectedly, they both pause, chuckling at some unspoken joke. My throat tightens. Somewhere beyond the clamor, a lute begins to play, its notes hesitant, searching, as if testing the air between strangers. The ledger trembles faintly beneath my fingertips, its edges worn smooth by years of travel along the Silk Road, while the heated voices intertwine overhead Mongol curses snapping like wind over the steppe, the lilt of Chinese merchants threading rebuttals like silk through a needle's eye. The air is thick with the smoky sweetness of sandalwood burning in bronze censers, the musk of horses still clinging to the Mongols' fur-lined deal, and the sharper tang of ginger and star anise rising from clay teapots passed between uneasy hands. Outside the merchant hall, the clatter of hooves against Konbalik's paved streets echoes like distant thunder, a reminder of the restless motion of empire, while muffled fragments of Uyghur, Persian, and Tibetan hum beyond the paper lattice windows, a chorus of tongues as layered as the spices weighed and bartered within. The cold edge of my ink brush hesitates over the ledger's pale page, and I watch the black pigment bleed into the fibers, spreading like ink dropped into water, uncertain where to fix the terms of the deal. The Mongolian trader, Batu, slams a leather-gloved fist onto the lacquered table, sending a ripple through the cups of butter tea, its rich, salty scent clashing with the delicate floral fragrance of the Chinese merchant master Li's jasmine brew. The sway of Master Li's embroidered robe sleeves, patterned with peonies and clouds, contrasts sharply with the heavy silver belt cinching Batu's waist, each adornment a manifesto of their worlds. Between them, bolts of Song Dynasty silk crimson as desert sunsets lie draped over a Mongol saddle, its carved birch frame inlaid with turquoise, an unwilling marriage of materials. Batu demands payment in silver ingots, weighed as his people have done for generations, but Li counters with republic paper notes, his fingers brushing the delicate scraps with reverence, as if they might dissolve like mulberry bark under too rough a touch. My hand cramps around the brush as I hesitate. This ledger is meant to be impartial, a reflection of transactions, not tensions, but how can ink capture the weight of history pressing upon each word? I think of my father's warnings before I joined this caravan. Numbers hold no loyalty, he'd said, but I had not understood then how ink could become a battleground when two systems collide like rivers dammed by stubborn rocks. The veins on Li's temple pulse as Batu scoffs, pulling a dagger from his belt to prick his thumb, offering blood oath instead of stamped contract, and the metallic scent cuts through the incense. Around us, shadows sway in the lantern light, stretching like warring dynasties across the ledger's margins. Li recoils, silk hissing against silk, while I force my brush downward, scribing figures in Mongol script and Chinese characters side by side, a fragile bridge. My stomach knots, the air grows heavier, but then a shift. Batu exhales sharply, nods at the dagger still glinting between them, and suddenly grins. He reaches not to threaten, but to slice a wedge from a roasted lamb leg browning on a nearby brazier, offering it to Li on the blade's flat. Silence, smoke curls between them. Then Li, ever meticulous, plucks a sliver of meat with ivory chopsticks, and as he chews, his rigid shoulders soften. The spices cumin, seared fat, traces of wild onion blend on their tongues, and it occurs to me that trade is not just silver or silk, but this. The unrecorded moment when hands lower, when taste overrules tradition. My brush moves again, carving columns onto the page like footsteps in fresh snow, delicate but deliberate. The ink dries darker where I pause, as if the ledger itself breathes between entries, waiting for the next uneasy harmony to emerge. The scent of sandalwood hung thick in the air, curling upwards from incense burners set outside storefronts, mingling with the smoky richness of roasting lamb skewers and the faint metallic tang of coins exchanged in the marketplace. Around me, the clatter of hooves on stone echoed beneath the hum of merchants, haggling in tongues both familiar and foreign Mongol commands, slicing through the fluid rise and fall of Mandarin. Uyghur traders laughing as they clinked cups of fermented mare's milk. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tightening unconsciously around the edge of my embroidered silk sleeve, smoothing the wrinkle I had just pressed into it, a nervous habit, though I told myself it was only the chill of the autumn wind coaxing me to seek warmth in the folds. Before me, the dispute unfolded like an unwieldy scroll. A Mongol horseman, barrel-chested and draped in fox pelts, stood with arms crossed, nostrils flared as he glared down at the Chinese merchant, whose hands fluttered like caged sparrows, his pristine ledger trembling between them. The horseman demanded payment in silver solid, unchanging, as reliable as the steppe sky. The merchant insisted on paper notes, light and efficient, his voice thin but stubborn. My throat tightened as I stepped between them, catching the sweat-slicked grip of the merchant's ledger in my palm, the coarse hide of the horseman's sleeve brushing my wrist as I raised my other hand to still them both. Breathe, I reminded myself, not in the measured rhythm of Confucian meditation, nor the fierce inhales taught by Mongol shamans before battle, but something between, something new. The weight of the moment settled upon my shoulders. This was more than a quarrel over currency. Silk had torn before between our peoples, and blood had soaked the ground where words failed. Could ink and intention mend it? My fingers tapped the merchant's ledger. What use were these neat columns when trust frayed at the edges? I glanced at the horseman's belt, where a jade pendant carved with a galloping stallion hung beside a bronze seal. Chinese craftsmanship. I realized, though worn with Mongol pride. An idea flickered. I turned back to the merchant, coaxing his fingers to unclench from the ledger, pressing instead a square of mulberry paper into his palm, then plucking a brush from his belt. "His silver," I murmured, "but your hand write his receipt as you would for your own kin, not as tribute, but as an oath." The horseman's gaze darkened. Literacy was not his comfort, but then I touched the pendant at his waist. "And you," I said softer, "let him etch the words into something lasting." I pointed to the merchant's seal, still warm from his grip. "Press it here beside your mark. Let the paper carry both." For a heartbeat, silence, save for the distant cry of a hawk circling above the city walls. Then, slowly, the horseman grunted, fingers uncurling to reveal a worn silver ingot. The merchant's brush hesitated, but when it swept across the page, the characters flowed not in the haste of obligation, but with the deliberate curve of a promise. And as the horseman's rough thumb smudged the edge of the seal into crimson wax beside the merchant's, I felt something unknot in my chest, like the first thaw of a frozen river, when neither ice nor water claims dominance, but both exist, blurred and beautiful, in the same shimmering current. The air in the tea-house is thick with the opulent weight of sandalwood and the sharper tang of burning horse dung in distant braziers. A cloying sweetness laced with the musk of sweating bodies pressed too close beneath the low-beamed ceiling. My hand trembles slightly as I dip the brush into ink, the fine hairs splaying against the ceramic rim, and I watch the slow drip of black onto the ledger's cream-colored page, a stain as dark as the unspoken doubts pooling in my chest. Around me, the elder merchant's men with fingers gnarled by decades of counting coins and haggling over silk lean in, their fur-lined sleeves brushing the low table, the clatter of jade beads against wooden abacus frames punctuating their murmurs. They speak in the clipped cadence of the step, throaty and rounded, but their eyes flicker with something unfamiliar hesitation, perhaps, or the uneasy stirring of curiosity as the young Chinese scholar before them. His handfu too sleek, his words too polished, sketches a proposal for shared trade routes in the dust of the table with one slender finger. The scent of roasted lamb drifts from a nearby stall, greasy and rich, mingling with the astringent bite of fermented mare's milk in their cups, and I breathe through the tension knotting my shoulders, the weight of ink-laden parchment pressing against my thigh like a silent accusation. The ledger must be precise, impartial, yet the scholar's words, fluid as river silk, slip between their skepticism, and I see the moment one elder's calloused thumb traces the edge of his own ledger, hesitating over the columns of numbers that have always dictated his world. A child's laughter bursts from the street outside, high and unburdened, and for an instant the rigid lines separating Mongol and Chinese, steppe and city, seem to blur like ink in water. The scholar's voice drops, weaving threads of Confucian ethics with the practicality of the caravan routes, and the oldest among them Badr, whose face is a map of sun-cracked leather grunts, rubbing the jade talisman at his throat, a relic from a dead wife who whispered Chinese poetry in the dark. I exhale, slow, watching the way the afternoon light filters through the lattice window, casting fleeting patterns across the table like the shifting alliances of empires. And in that fragile, honeyed glow, I glimpse it. The fragile possibility of a world where ledgers are not ledgers of division, but bridges. The brush moves again, capturing not just numbers, but the quiet unraveling of an old way, and my pulse quickens with the foolish, soaring hope that history might be written in something softer than blood. The scent of sandalwood and incense, thick from the temples lining the market avenue, coiled around the sharper tang of horse, sweat, and iron as the Mongol riders approached 30 men, perhaps more, their armored torsos catching the morning sunlight in splinters of steel and lacquered leather. The clatter of their horses' hooves against the paving stones fractured the usual drone of barter and banter. Merchants pausing mid-haggle, hands still clasped around bolts of silk or stoppered jars of medicinal powders, their eyes flicking sidelong as the riders fanned through the crowd like a blade unsheathed. I caught the snatches of their speech, the guttural Mongol commands, the clipped Chinese of their interpreter, but above all, the silence that settled in their wake, punctuated only by the nervous clearing of a throat or the shuffle of feet retreating toward doorways. Beneath my fingers, the ledger's pages prickled like dry leaves, and though I willed my hand steady, my brush hovered uncertainly over the column of debts and payments, the ink trembling like a living thing. These were not the usual enforcers, no. These men wore the wolf-tail insignia of the court's most ruthless inspectors, sent to collect tariffs or seize goods without warning, their authority as absolute and perilous as a storm over the grasslands. I thought of our hidden storerooms, the bolts of Song Dynasty brocade tucked beneath false-bottomed crates, the porcelain disguised as common. Where would it be enough? The air tasted of dust and roasted lamb fat from a nearby stall, but my mouth ran dry as the lead rider reined in before our caravan's treasurer, his saddle creaking like a ship's rigging in wind. Behind him, the city pulsed monks chanting behind crimson gates, a child's laughter tangled with the cry of a kite seller, the ceaseless murmur of languages pressed together like mismatched puzzle pieces. Yuan rule had forced these fragments into coexistence, yet frictions simmered beneath every exchange. The rider reached for the treasurer's registry, his gauntleted fingers flicking dismissively through pages thick with our careful script, and I felt my ribs tighten. One stroke of his seal could ruin us, yet there was something almost beautiful in his precision, the way cultures now clashed and melded in moments like this. Brush and blade, ledger and law, all bound beneath the same unyielding sky. Somewhere beyond the market's haze, a caged nightingale began to sing, a wild voice trapped but still defiant, and for a heartbeat, I imagined a world where customs were not weapons but threads in a greater tapestry, where the ink of one people might bleed seamlessly into the strokes of another. The rider's gaze lifted, and I exhaled, readying my brush. History was here, pressing down upon us, waiting to be recorded. The feast hall thrummed with life around them, aromas of sandalwood and smoky incense curling through the air, mingling with the salt and fat of roasting meats, the earthy sweetness of millet wine. But the scholar felt suspended in the narrow world of carved wooden cups and low murmurs between himself and the Mongol horsemen across from him. One of them, a rider with wind-burned cheeks and a fur-lined deal rolled at the sleeves, gestured emphatically as he spoke, his voice rough but warm, like gravel smoothed by river water. The scholar blinked, tracking the way the candlelight caught on the man's silver rings, the faint tremor in his own fingers as he set down his cup too hard, splashing tea onto the lacquered table before leaning forward, elbows propped on knees. In the plains where I was born, the horseman was saying, The sky is so vast a man might ride for days and nights without seeing another soul, only the endless roll of grass bending beneath the wind. The scholar's throat tightened, fingers curling into his palms. He thought suddenly of his own cramped study in Dadu, the way he had traced the same characters over and over on silk paper until the ink bled, the sound of merchants' shouts from the streets below seeping in through latticed windows, distant but insistent. Yet here, the scholar murmured, hesitating as he searched for words that would bridge the chasm between them, between walls of stone and walls of felt, between ink and saddle leather. Here, the city is a river, always flowing, always loud. The horseman grinned, teeth flashing white against his sun-darkened skin. I heard tales of your towers that touch the clouds, but I did not believe them until I rode through the gates. Around them, voices rose and fell in a dozen tongues, Persian merchants bargaining over silk, Tibetan monks chanting blessings, the clatter of hooves on the flagstones outside rattling through the open doorway like the steady pulse of a drum. The scholar exhaled, slow and measured, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest. How strange. To sit with men who had once been strangers, now trading stories like merchants traded jade and spices. And yet, beneath it all, an unease lingered like the memory of winter in spring soil. The unspoken tension of a land split between two peoples, two worlds, neither willing to bend. He thought of the great Yu, taming the floods by working with the river rather than against it, and swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "Tell me," he said at last, watching as the horseman's laughter lit up his face like sunlight on steppe grass, "do your people also tell stories of the dragons that live beneath the earth?" The rider's eyes gleamed, and in that instant the scholar imagined a loom weaving threads of silk and horsehair into something new, something neither wholly Mongol nor wholly Han, but alive with the breath of both. The ledger lies open on my lap, parchment smooth beneath my fingertips, but my eyes drift upward past the wavering columns of ink and numbers to the mingled figures around the campfire. The scent of sandalwood still clings to the folds of my robes, though the brisk night air carries sharper notes now. The bitterness of charred fat dripping from skewers of roasted lamb, the herbal sting of mountain tea steeping in a dented bronze kettle, the sour musk of sweat-soaked furs. Hooves no longer clatter against the packed earth courtyard, though their echoes linger in my ears alongside the murmurs of merchants from Chang'an haggling in quick, rhythmic Mandarin, the guttural rasp of Mongol captains laughing over fermented mare's milk, the lilting Persian of spice traders weaving folktales into the smoke. A chill threads through the embroidered silk of my sleeves as I watch the first hesitant exchange, a young Mongol rider offering a slice of dried apricot to a Han merchant's apprentice, his fingers lingering just a breath too long before withdrawing, and something tightens in my chest. It is a ledger's habit, this counting of distances. The way the merchant's son hesitates before biting into the fruit, the way the horseman's shoulders soften when no insult comes. The firelight dances between them, gilding the rim of a shared cup passed hand to hand, and for an instant, the numbers in my mind dissolve. I think of my father's stories of the war banners that once flew where these market stalls now stand, of the way he used to trace the scars on his wrists and say harmony is not the absence of conflict, but the choice to set down the blade even when your hands remember its weight. The kettle hisses, steam unspools into the dark like an unanswered question. Nearby, a grizzled camel driver demonstrates the intricate knotwork of his tribe's harnesses, his calloused hands moving with slow precision while a cluster of silk weavers from Suzhou lean in, their own slender fingers twitching as if longing to replicate the pattern. Someone strums a pipa, the notes trembling like a bridge woven from spiders' silk between two dissonant melodies. I exhale, watching my breath fog the air above the ledger's page where the figures so neat, so certain cannot capture this. The way the wind carries a fragment of someone's laughter into the branches of an ancient plum tree, scattering petals over the mismatched circle of turned faces. The way a Mongol woman's silver-chased dagger gleams beside a Jiangnan porcelain teacup, both catching the same flame. The pine resin pops, sending up a shower of sparks that etch fleeting constellations against the sky, a map without borders, written in fire and vanishing before it can be deciphered. My brush hovers over the ledger, ink poised to transcribe the unsayable. The mid-afternoon sun slanted lazily between the merchant's stalls, casting long, amber-drenched fingers across the uneven stone streets where the mingled dust of countless journeys still hung suspended like a promise. The scent of sandalwood rich, discerning, barely yielding precedence to the sharper tang of incense smoldering in brass holders blended with the musk of horse sweat, and the honeyed aroma of roasted meats sizzling over open braziers, their fat dripping onto coals with tiny eruptions of smoke. The clatter of hooves on worn stone, the rhythmic creak of wooden cart wheels, the dissonant yet harmonious murmur of tongues Uyghur, Persian, Mongol, and the lilting cadence of northern Chinese all wove themselves into the air like threads in a brocade, transient yet eternal. I paused, the smooth bamboo handle of my brush hovering above the ledger's parchment, arrested by the sound of laughter unfettered, unguarded rising from a knot of traders squatted in the shade of a merchant's awning. A Mongol, his beard coarse and flecked with the dust of the northern steppes, slapped his knee as his Chinese counterpart doubled over, chest shaking with mirth, the dangling sleeves of his silk robe swaying like willow fronds in the breeze. The air between them shimmered with something more than amusement. It was recognition, a spark struck from flint, brief but illuminating. My fingers tightened imperceptibly around the brush, the wood warm from my grip, the ink drying dark at its tip. How many entries had I marked before this one tallies of disputes, negotiations stilted by mistrust, the careful dance of Mongol and Chinese traders circling one another like wary wolves. And yet here they were, unraveling into laughter over something as simple as a mispronounced word, or perhaps a joke told badly in a tongue halfway learned, the misstep not a wall but a bridge. The memory of last winter surfaced unbidden. The frozen silence between two merchant captains, their breath visible in the cold, their hands clenched around silk samples neither would relinquish. Back then, the only sound had been the hollow clink of copper coins counted too slowly. But now the laughter rolled outward, catching like fire in dry grass, and I found myself leaning forward, my own breath stilled, as if afraid the moment might dissolve if I exhaled. The Mongol trader wiped tears from his sun-creased eyes, his fur-lined deal shifting with the motion, the soft clatter of his belt's silver ornaments like distant temple bells. His Chinese companion, still chuckling, reached for a shared cup of tea, the porcelain glowing translucent in the sunlight, and for a heartbeat, their fingers brushed, neither pulling away. My brush descended, the characters flowing almost of their own accord, the ink capturing not just the fact of laughter, but the weight of it, fragile, irreplaceable. The afternoon stretched, golden and heavy, as though the very earth hesitated to move forward and disrupt what had been found here, this fragile, unspoken accord, as fleeting and enduring as the scent of sandalwood on the wind. The air in the scholar's courtyard was thick with the heady sweetness of sandalwood curling from bronze censers, mingling with the smoky tang of roasting lamb on spits, outside a scent that evoked the vast steppe camps of my childhood, where the wind carried the cries of horsemen and the musk of yak butter tea. Yet beneath it all lingered the delicate fragrance of osmanthus blossoms, their golden petals dusting the stone path beneath my feet, a whisper of Han elegance amidst the Mongol vigor. The scholar's voice, measured as a temple bell, cut through the murmur of servants shuffling between the kitchen and the hall, their dialects a tapestry of northern lilt and southern cadence. His proposal a feast where roasted mutton would share the table with delicate lotus seed buns, where Mongol throat singers might trade verses with scholars reciting Li Bai, sent a slow, restless tremor through my fingers as I traced the rim of my porcelain teacup. Could such a thing be more than a fragile truce of flavors and words? I glanced at the inkstone beside him, the black slab carved with a dragon coiled around a wolf, and wondered if harmony could ever be more than a fleeting dance of symbols. My pulse quickened at the memory of my father, his hands calloused from rains, scoffing at the ink-stained men who bent over scrolls while the world moved to the rhythm of hoofbeats. Yet here, in this collision of spice-laden air and scholarly quiet, I tasted a possibility like the first sip of tea that blooms from bitterness into sweetness. The weight of the ledger in my satchel seemed heavier suddenly, its pages filled with columns of silk bolts and spices, but also the unwritten tension between my Mongol blood and the Han city that had become my home. Outside, a horse whinnied, its bridle jingling like distant temple chimes, and for a moment I saw it clearly. Not a forced merging, but a braiding, like the threads of a brocade where gold and crimson don't fade but shine brighter side by side. The scholar's brush hovered over a scrap of paper, and in the silence before it touched, I felt the hush of ancestors leaning in warriors and poets alike waiting to see which stroke, which flavor, which note would come next. The golden glow of the setting sun spills across the courtyard, gilding the dust that swirls lazily above the cobblestones, each mote catching fire before vanishing into the lengthening shadows. The air is thick with the perfume of sandalwood, its sweetness twining with the earthier musk of curring leather and the pungent tang of yak butter melting over crackling fires. Closer, the sharp scent of ginger and garlic rises from earthenware pots where flatbreads sizzle in camel fat, while skewers of mutton and wild pheasant drip juices onto glowing embers, the hiss and pop of fat sending thin spirals of blue-gray smoke skyward. Beneath it all, the faintest hint of jasmine lingers some merchant's wife passing by earlier, her silk sleeves brushing against baskets of dried apricots and fermented mare's milk. My quill hovers above the ledger as voices weave through the space like threads of a half-remembered song. The guttural cadences of Mongol traders haggling over bolts of brocade, the flowing, lyrical mandarin of a spice seller extolling the virtues of his Sichuan peppercorns, and somewhere, softly, the rhythmic drone of a Persian lullaby hummed by a camel driver as he braids strands of his horse's mane. The call to prayer from a distant mosque drifts over the courtyard walls, harmonizing with the chime of silver bells sewn onto a dancer's sash. I exhale slowly, watching my breath curl like incense in the cooling air, and press the tip of the quill to the page, the ink spreading in a dark blossom each stroke a futile attempt to capture the way these moments defy neat columns and tallies. My fingers tighten around the shaft, remembering my father's words delivered years ago as he handed me this ledger: numbers never lie. But here now, the truth resists capture. The Khan's scribes demand order commodities listed in strict rows, taxes calculated to the last copper, when yet how do I quantify the way the Mongol traders clasp the elbows of their Chinese partners, a gesture of respect borrowed from the Tang Dynasty, or the way the Caravan's children, half speaking both tongues, scramble between the legs of cooks, snatching scraps of dough to shape into tiny horses, their laughter a language all its own. A gust of wind lifts the corner of the ledger, rustling the pages like a flock of restless starlings. And for a heartbeat, the ink blurs was that a drop of sweat, or had I paused too long, transfixed by the sight of the old Uyghur potter kneeling beside the well, his hands pressing Mongol argil and Chinese clay into a single vessel. The bitterness of salted tea blooms on my tongue as I take a sip from the cracked cup beside me, its rim chipped from the journey west. It tastes of steppes and river valleys, of the road that has carried us all whether by choice or fate to this crossroads. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a lute begins to play, its melody winding through the clatter of wooden bowls and the low murmur of shared stories. And I think of the countless nights spent hunched over this ledger, ink staining my sleeves as I tried to separate the world into neat, legible lines. But tonight, beneath a sky streaked with the last light of day, the boundaries dissolve. The Mongol chieftain passes a porcelain teacup to the hand merchant, their fingers briefly overlapping on the delicate blue and white glaze. A Tibetan monk breaks bread with a Nestorian priest, their palms upturned in simultaneous blessing. I close my eyes, listening to the rhythm of hands kneading dough, the scrape of knives against whetstones, the contented sigh of a child lulled to sleep against her mother's shoulder sounds that carry no numerals, no equivalents. When I open them again, the ink has dried, and I realize I have not written a single character. The ledger will have to wait. For now, I set it aside and reach for a skewer of roasted meat, the spices lingering on my tongue as the stars begin their slow ascent, weaving the heavens together, stitch by invisible stitch. The scent of sandalwood and incense curled through the silk-draped tavern, mingling with the sweat of travelers and the lingering bite of cold wind still clinging to their furs. Bronze lamps flickered against the low ceiling, casting shifting pools of amber light upon scarred wooden tables where bowls of roasted lamb steamed beside cups of bitter chrysanthemum tea. I traced my fingers across the grain of the table, feeling the grooves where countless tankards had left their mark, as around me the horsemen broad-shouldered Mongols with sun-darkened faces framed by braided queues leaned forward, their voices rough as gravel beneath the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves still echoing from the stone streets outside. One of them, a man named Dadu, tapped his silver-plated fingernail against his cup, eyes gleaming like polished onyx as he recounted the vast emptiness of the steppe, the way the wind howled across grasslands that stretched so wide a man might ride 10 days without glimpsing a single soul. His words conjured images of yurts like scattered pearls, of wolves singing beneath a sky so immense it made the stars seem close enough to pluck like ripe fruit. To his left, a merchant from Kashgar, face lined from sun and smiling, cupped his hands as if holding precious water, reciting a poem about the jeweled cities of Samarkand, where the domes shone like beaten gold and the call to prayer rippled through the air like silk unfurling. My chest tightened as I listened, torn between the raw, untamed longing in Batu's voice and the merchant's lilting verses, each a thread in the tapestry we were weaving here, now, in this smoky room where the scent of horsehide and cinnamon twined together. Beneath the murmur of Uyghur, Persian, and Mongol dialects, beneath the clink of bowls and the scrape of benches, I felt the deeper tremor, the unspoken question of whether these worlds could truly meet or merely brush against one another before spinning apart again like wind-scattered seeds. My nails dug into my palm as I remembered my grandfather's warning, hissed through teeth stained dark by beetle nut. The Khan's roads bind us, but they do not blend us. Yet here, in the fragile warmth of shared stories, I glimpsed something softer, a harmony not forced, but found like the way the ink of my brush had once bled effortlessly into damp paper, dark and light marrying without eclipse. The merchant's last verse trailed into silence, and Batu grunted, reaching across to refill his cup not with arag, but with the merchant's honeyed grape wine, his calloused fingers brushing against silk sleeves in a fleeting, deliberate touch. The lantern light caught the edge of his smile, and for a heartbeat, the tavern itself seemed to hold its breath. The ink stains my fingertips like bruises as I unroll the ledger's parchment onto the low wooden table, the lamplight flickering golden over columns of characters and numbers, some crisp, some smudged by haste or exhaustion. Outside the tent, the scent of sandalwood curls through the evening air, mingling with the acrid tang of horse sweat and the lingering sweetness of roasting lamb from the fires where Mongol riders and Chinese merchants trade stories over skewered meat. The city hums around me, its pulse uneven yet rhythmic. The clatter of a night market's dice game, the distant chime of temple bells, the muffled argument in Uyghur and Mongolian drifting from a neighboring stall. I exhale, pressing my palms flat against the ledger, as if to steady the restless energy of today's accounts the way Zhang the spice trader stiffened when Batu spoke over him. How the Mongol guards laughed too loudly at a joke the silk weavers did not understand. Each exchange is etched into the parchment, but the numbers alone cannot capture the weight of those silences, the tightening of shoulders, the way Batu's hand lingered near his dagger when the Chinese merchants clustered closer, their silk sleeves whispering like cautious conspirators. My brush hovers, hesitating over the empty margin where I might annotate more than just silver and silk, where I could confess my own unease how the old divisions, masked by the clinking of teacups and forced smiles, still trace fault lines beneath this fragile unity. The candle gutters, casting shadows that stretch like grasping fingers across the tent's felt walls, and for a moment I imagine the ledger itself as a living thing, its fibers straining to hold the tensions of two worlds. A drop of ink falls, blooming dark as a storm cloud, and I press the brush again, this time not to record debts, but to trace a single character, hey, harmony beside the sums, as if the shape of the word could will the thing itself into being. Somewhere beyond the tent flaps, a lute begins to play, a Mongol melody threaded with Chinese ornamentation, and I close my eyes, letting the music wrap around me like the first fragile threads of a bridge I am desperate to build. The last amber glow of sunset drowned in the ink-dark sky as lanterns flickered to life along Chang'an Boulevard, their trembling light catching the gleam of Mongol horse brass and the embroidered edges of Chinese merchants' robes. Sandalwood smoke curled from braziers, threading through the mingled scents of roasting lamb fat and crackling Sichuan peppercorns, heady, foreign, familiar while beneath my brush. The ledger's thin paper absorbed ink as eagerly as the earth drinks rain. Just beyond the makeshift circle of traders, a Mongol horseman, his face wind-carved like the steppes' ancient cliffs, extended a carved jade amulet to a silk merchant from Suzhou, whose fingers soft from counting abacus beads hesitated before closing around the offering. My hand paused mid-character, hovering over the column of debts and gifts as if suspended by the weight of the moment. The slight tremor in the merchant's wrist as he reciprocated with a bolt of cloud-patterned silk, the horseman's calloused thumb brushing the fabric with unexpected reverence. Around us, the night hummed horses snuffling at troughs, the low chant of a Tibetan monk's prayer, the distant clatter of dice in a gambling den, yet all of it felt distant, muffled, as though we stood inside the fragile shell of a new understanding. The ledger demanded numbers, but what flowed from my brush were shadows. The way the lantern flames gilded the Mongol's wolf fur collar and the merchant's shaved forehead alike, how their laughter, when it finally broke, sounded like two rivers finding the same course. I remembered the scorn hissed in alleyways days prior barbarians from the north, grasping southerners, and how neatly those words dissolved now under the weight of a gift given without expectation. My own fingers, ink-stained and stiff from the evening chill, tightened around the brush as if to anchor myself against the swell of something perilously like hope. Perhaps this was how the world knitted itself whole again, not by grand decrees, but by these small, mortal offerings tea poured without measuring the cost, a shared pull of sour arag from the same lacquered bowl, the unspoken pact in a traded glance. The ledger would never capture the horseman's throat bobbing as he bowed his head, nor the merchant's unsteady exhale, but it would hold the proof of exchange, the numbers blunt and unadorned. Beyond the circle, a child half Mongol by the slant of her eyes, half hand by the cut of her tunic darted between stalls, chasing a stray hen, and for a breath I let myself envision a city where such duality was unremarkable, where the clash of tongues in the marketplace was not dissonance but harmony. The night deepened. Somewhere a lutenist plucked a nomad's song on a pipa's strings. I dipped my brush again, the ink dark as the space between stars, and wrote. The quill hovers above the rice paper, dripping a single bead of ink that bleeds into the fibers like an unanswered question, while the mingled scents of sandalwood and distant incense drift through the open lattice window, carrying whispers of the capital's ceaseless pulse hooves clattering over cobbled streets. The rhythmic sway of merchants calls in tongues that tangle like silk threads in the wind, the faint, honeyed sweetness of roasted lamb curling from a nearby vendor's stall. My fingers tremble slightly against the brush's bamboo stem, aware of the weight of what must be said, what must be pressed into permanence between these delicate pages. Beneath my knees, the woven rush mat bites faintly into my skin, a grounding discomfort amidst the swirl of thoughts how to shape verse that might stitch together the rift between the stern, sweeping strokes of Mongol script and the measured elegance of hand characters. How to carve a path through the mist of suspicion that clings to both sides like the morning dew on the city's tiled roofs. The air is thick with the musk of horsehide and dye vats, the sharp tang of iron from the blacksmith's quarter, the damp earthiness of inkstone and wet clay, and beneath it all, the unmistakable breath of autumn cool, restless, tugging at the hem of my robe like a child's impatient hand. I close my eyes and let the cacophony seep into me, the distant thrum of a lute from a pleasure house, the rustle of silk against fur as a Mongol noblewoman passes the courtyard, her sleeves embroidered with dragons that mirror the hand motifs yet coil with a wilder, untamed grace. Memory surges forth. The first time I saw a bowl of mare's milk beside a cup of jasmine tea, the way the steam curled together into a single vanishing sigh, a harmony unseen but felt. My breath steadies as I press the brush down, watching the first character bloom harmony, not as submission, but as the marriage of river and sky at twilight, each borrowing the other's color without surrender. Each stroke is deliberate, the ink pooling and feathering like roots seeking unseen water, and I imagine the words taking root in the ledger's spine, woven between columns of taxes and tributes, a quiet rebellion against the ledger's cold arithmetic. The city hums around me, a living thing somewhere. A child laughs in a dialect that blends northern lilt with southern cadence, and a potter's wheel spins clay mingled from Mongol plains and southern riverbeds. My wrist aches with the tension of holding so much hope in a single line, but I press on, carving syllables that could be a bridge, however fragile. The final stroke lingers, a curve like the arch of a merchant's eyebrow when he recognizes a kindred soul beyond language, like the unspoken understanding between two travelers sharing a fire in the wilderness. The poem sits now, complete, a fragile vessel holding the unspoken yearning of 1,000 chance encounters in the marketplace, the silent bargains struck between weaver and herdsman, between astronomer and shaman. As I blow gently on the page, the ink glistens under the shifting light, no longer merely black, but alive with the hues of a world straining toward something new. Carefully, as if cradling a fledgling bird, I place the poem between the ledger's pages, where the weight of history will press it into permanence. A whispered manifesto hidden in plain sight, waiting for the day when hands, Mongol and Han alike, might trace its characters and feel, for a moment, the pulse of the same dream. The air is thick with the mingled scents of smoldering sandalwood and the faint, sweet tang of burning incense, drifting lazily from the clay braziers set between the tents, the thin trails of smoke curling upward like the whispers of restless spirits. Nearby, the soft clatter of horse hooves on the worn stone streets has faded into a distant, rhythmic murmur as the animals settle, their breaths steady and warm against the cooling night, their hides gleaming under the golden flicker of oil lamps strung between the carts. I sit cross-legged on a woolen rug, the ledger open before me, the ink still fresh from today's tallies, the page a patchwork of precise characters, some brushed with the elegant strokes of Chinese scribes, others carrying the stark, swift lines of Mongol hands. My fingers hover over the parchment, tracing the curves of each numeral, each name, feeling the faint ridges where the ink has pooled, lingering over the evidence of this fragile equilibrium we have carved from the day's labor. Around me, voices hum in a dozen tongues the low, guttural cadence of Mongolian banter beside the lyrical rise and fall of Chinese merchants haggling over the last of the roasted lamb, its rich, fatty aroma still clinging to the air, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly boiled tea leaves and the faint metallic tang of the distant forge, where a blacksmith's hammer still rings, sporadic and stubborn, against the anvil. A child laughs, high and bright, chasing the flicker of a moth caught in the lantern's glow, their tiny feet pattering against the packed earth, the sound swallowed by the thick folds of night. I close my eyes for a breath, just one, feeling the weight of all these threads, the way they tangle and weave, the way they pull taut or slacken, like reins held in uncertain hands. The ledger is more than numbers. It is a record of harmonies, of silences stretched thin over grudges and gratitude, of hands passing good spices, silks, furs across thresholds of suspicion and trust. My own breath steadies as I listen to the slow unraveling of the day, the gradual softening of voices into sighs, the creak of saddle leather as men settle into their bedrolls, the rustle of felt blankets pulled snug against the creeping chill. In this quiet, I remember the first time I saw a Mongol warrior and a hand silk merchant share a flask of rice wine, their laughter rough but earnest, their eyes wary but curious how the tension had trembled between them like a plucked string before settling into something like respect. The memory lingers, bittersweet, a fragile hope pressed between the pages of my thoughts. Outside the ring of firelight, the city murmurs on, a living thing somewhere, a lute plucks a wandering tune, a dog barks, a pot clangs. But here, in this small circle of warmth, the caravan breathes as one, a temporary kingdom of borrowed peace. I run my thumb along the ledger's edge, feeling the grain of the paper, the quiet promise of tomorrow's work, and wonder, not for the first time, if this fragile, fleeting balance is what the sages meant when they spoke of the middle way. The ink dries, the night deepens, and for now that is enough. Under the moonlit sky, the ledger rests in my lap, its worn pages fraying at the edges like the hem of an old Mongol deal. Heavy with the weight of the day's accounts not just of silver and silk, but of voices clashing and weaving together in the great loom of Konbalik's bustling streets. The scent of sandalwood curls from a nearby brazier, its thin, blue smoke mingling with the sharper tang of mutton skewers roasting over open fires. with the leather andiron musk of the Mongol horsemen who still clatter through the city even at this late hour, their laughter rough-edged but warm as they call to one another in their guttural tongue. Around me, the murmur of Persian traders debating the price of jade blends with the sing-song chatter of Han merchants tallying their abacus beads, while above it all, the steady drip of water from the eaves of a nearby tea-house marks time like an anxious heartbeat. The air is thick with the late summer dampness, clinging to my skin, pressing the thin silk of my robes against my shoulders like an impatient creditor demanding attention. I lift my eyes to the moon, bloated and pale as a steamed bun, and exhale slowly, deliberately feeling the tremor in my fingers soften as they trace the ledger's column of figures, each stroke a fragile bridge between Mongol and Chinese hands. Today, the market overseer, a barrel-chested Mongol with weathered cheeks, had grunted in reluctant approval at the way I smoothed over a dispute between him and a Cantonese spice seller. My halting Mongolian wrapped around the measured cadence of a northern Chinese dialect, neither wholly one nor the other, but something that bent like willow between them. The spice seller's hands had paused mid-gesture, his habitual scowl faltering as the overseer unexpectedly laughed, slapping the counter with a force that made the curling slips of pepper and dried ginger shiver in their porcelain bowls. That moment, fleeting as the flicker of lamplight on a drawn blade, lingers now in me how the weightless shift of tone could tip the scales between conflict and compromise, how the scent of cardamom and horse sweat had blurred into something singular, almost sweet. Did the old Tang poets feel this when their verses slipped between worlds? I rub my thumb along the ledger's spine, imagining the generations of hands that have smoothed this same path, each leaving behind invisible traces of saffron dust, ink stains, the salt of sweat. Outside the dirt tent I share with two other scribes, a night breeze stirs, carrying the distant drone of a shamisen, not the refined pluck of a southern courtesan's tune, but the looser, wilder strumming of a Mongol horseman who learned it from a Uyghur minstrel, played now with a roughness that cracks the melody open like an egg, yolk bright and new. Something unspools in my chest. The ledger this broken, mendied thing is proof. Here, on this page, a Mongol chieftain's debt is written in bold strokes beside a Jiangnan weaver's request for wool, their characters leaning into each other like conspirators sharing a secret. Here in the margins, I've scratched the Uyghur word for trust next to the Chinese glyph for promise, arrows drawn between them like silk threads pulled taut on a loom. The overseer's laughter echoes again in memory, and I press my palms flat against the ledger's pages as if I could imprint the warmth of it into the paper, as if the fragile truce of today could be pressed like a flower between these leaves, preserved. Beyond the tent flap, the moon paints the city's tiled roofs in mercury, turning Konbalik into a dream of itself neither wholly Mongol nor Chinese, but something still trembling into being, like the first green shoot of a willow forcing itself through the cracked earth of a battlefield. And I, with my ink-stained fingers, my mongrel tongue am here to bear witness. The parchment folds beneath my fingers with a soft rustle, brittle from the dust of the road, yet still supple where the ink has soaked in deep. The scent of sandalwood curls from the last of the incense sticks smoldering beside me, mingling with the musk of horse sweat, and the metallic tang of the night cooling the stone streets beyond the caravanserai echoes of the day's clamor still linger in whispers. In the creak of a distant cartwheel, in the fading laughter of merchants sharing one last cup of arag before sleep claims them. I stretch my fingers, stiff from holding the brush, and press them into the hollow tempad of my palm, feeling the ghost of the handle still there, the weight of words etched and unspoken alike. The ledger lies heavy in my lap, its spine cracked from months of travel, its pages crammed with columns, silvers and silks, debts and promises, names written in Mongolian script beside names in delicate hand strokes, each line a fragile truce between two worlds. Outside, a breeze stirs. It carries the aroma of charred lamb fat from a vendor's dying fire, the sweetness of ripening persimmons from a nearby orchard, and beneath it all, the dry whisper of the desert, always waiting beyond the oasis of this momentary peace. My thumb traces the edge of the ledger where the pages have curled here, a smudged record of a deal brokered between a Uyghur spice trader and a Mongol horseman. There, a note of gratitude from a hand scribe who had never before bargained in the tongue of the steppe. Each entry is a thread pulled taut across the gulfs between us, woven together by necessity if not yet trust. The candle flickers, casting shadows like restless spirits across the courtyard where the caravan sleeps, horses huffing in their pickets, guards murmuring in half-dreams, their languages blurring like ink in rain. I close my eyes and listen. The murmur of the city is a living thing, the clatter of wooden sandals on flagstones, the distant pluck of a pipa from some sleepless tavern, notes drifting like leaves on water. Tomorrow, we move deeper into the heartland, where the walls of Jiangdu rise, where Mongol governors sit in painted halls once ruled by Han emperors, where the streets hum with dialects that still stumble over one another in uneasy harmony. The ledger whispers promises not of conquest now, but of something slower, quieter. The way a potter's clay remembers the shape of hands long gone, the way silk unfurls, patient beneath the brush. I press the cover shut, and in the silence that follows, I think of the seal tucked in my sash, a gift from a linen merchant, carved with my name in both scripts, twin dragons coiled around the characters as if guarding the space between them. Somewhere beyond these walls, the wind sighs through the locust trees, scattering petals like benedictions over the cobbles. Soon, the dawn will come, and with it, the road. But for now, there is only this. The weight of the ledger in my hands, the warmth of the candle, and the fragile, humming hope that every stroke of ink might yet become a bridge.